Welcome to Ask Sean, where I explore all sorts of questions about being human and invite you, the listener, to become more present to yourself, your relationships, and your life. I'm Sean Slevin, a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And if you have a question for me, you can send that to me anonymously at asksean.org. So in this video, I want to reflect about stories, particularly the stories that we tell ourselves about other people. Now, I did a video a couple of years ago about kind of the stories that we inhabit, the ways in which stories from our wounding have a way of casting a shadow and kind of influencing kind of how we live in the present and into the future. And so how we can kind of keep ourselves trapped in a wounded story in a way that's not really, it's not serving us, it's not helping us actually work through or move forward. So this overlaps, what I'm going to talk about today, overlaps with that in that it's also related to our wounding and how we are working with or not working with our wounding, the ways our wounding can still be influencing us, these places that are still needing healing. But this is a little bit more focused on the stories that we tell ourselves about others, which is going to have implications also. There's also embedded in that story we're telling about ourselves, right? But the emphasis here is on how, particularly in the absence of information, we have a way of filling in the gaps. And that's not all bad, right? I mean, like, we're always, kind of dealing with limited information. We don't know all the things, right? We're not inside another person. And so it's useful to be able to fill in the gaps. I mean, that's part of how we can function. The problem is sometimes we fill in the gaps incorrectly and then very incorrectly. And so we're literally making up a whole story about what we think this person feels, what we think their motivations are, what we imagine they think or feel about us, all these kinds of things. And typically when we're doing that out of a wounded place, we do not err on the positive of like, well, they're probably, it's probably wonderful and they probably think wonderful things about us. We tend to err on the side of sort of more towards the negative. And that's because from a survival standpoint, it is more useful to sort of proactively imagine and prepare for, the bad thing, right? Like if you've been bitten by, I often say, if you have been bitten by a snake, then from a survival standpoint, treating every stick as a potential snake is useful because it's like, we don't want to get bit again. I could die, I could be, get poisoned again. So there's a certain benefit to that, but obviously that's not, it's not a great way to live, right? Like it helps you survive. It keeps you alive. It, wards off danger proactively, but it also wards off the good. I mean, in this very poor analogy, right? Like I'm missing out on all sorts of interesting sticks on the ground because I'm afraid they're all snakes. Now, again, analogy kind of breaks down there, but I mean, well, when I was a kid, I did find sticks very interesting. I mean, I find them interesting now too, but thinking about people, right? Thinking about relationships. If I am proactively imagining negative things about other people, telling myself negative stories about others because I'm trying to protect myself, like that, that's going to result in my missing out on good that might actually be present. Like they might not be thinking or feeling negative things about me at all. Now, granted, this is really tricky, right? Because I'm not saying we shouldn't take steps to protect ourselves. I'm not saying that there isn't a place for, proactively being careful about danger and whatnot. So how do we decide what's the healthy and unhealthy version of this, right? Like, how do we discern that? And also, how do we, and this is very much related, like, how do we catch ourselves in kind of the unhealthy form of this, right? How do we recognize when I am telling myself stories that I don't have any basis for, right? I'm writing a fiction here, how do I catch that? How do I know the difference, right? Because it can feel so freaking real and persuasive, right? Like there have been times where I have felt hurt by somebody, and they may have, in fact, maybe even done something hurtful, but I'm feeling such an intensity that I am definitely adding to the story, right? So whatever the actual infraction might have been, or we can use examples where like nobody hurt me at all, but something got touched. Again, a wound got touched, a sensitive area got touched, and it was so intense what came up. Like I wasn't able to immediately recognize, like, oh, this is my stuff. It was just like, oh, they hurt me, and blah, 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 and here's all the things I'm imagining about who they are and what they're doing and what a terrible person, blah, 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 blah. Right? And then I'm, send the proverbial angry text or email or, maybe say horrible things in person, right? And then eventually, my energy comes down and some other parts of me start to wake up and are like, what's all this carnage around here? Why is everything on fire? Like, what did we do? And I might eventually, hopefully, start to realize like, oh, shit. I assumed a whole bunch of things. And I might start to be able to open myself up to taking in new information and finding out like, oh, I was wrong about a lot of stuff and I said and did some really hurtful things in response, in the story that I had constructed about this other person. I had something like this happen recently where I was on the receiving end. I've had lots of experiences on both sides, right? And where somebody had, we had an interaction about something and just started a conversation about something that had touched something really sensitive for them. And in the absence of information, they went and filled in a whole story about what they thought I meant and all these implications of that, and then were proceeding to, pass some judgment on me for that, which I recognized and could understand because it's like, oh, I have done that. But this is a delicate moment, right? Because it would be really easy, we could have a real fun time of like, well, let's both do this, right? They can be making up stories about me, I can make up stories about them, and you can imagine then how, oh gosh, relationships, friendships, connection of any kind can get really destroyed by this, when both parties are doing this. And so I was really paying attention with myself as I was anticipating seeing this person again and having some follow-up conversation and getting to clarify. I was trying to think through and pay attention to what was coming up inside of me. Like, did I have any charge? Was I telling any stories, right? And so I was really trying to check myself. So this gets to, kind of one of our questions, right? Is like, so how do we catch this, right? How do we know if we're doing this or not, right? Because again, we're always somewhat guessing about what's going on with other people. And that's just a part of life. But, the unhelpful guessing, I would say, the unhealthy storytelling is when it's being driven by these places of wounding in us. And what I mean by that, that in itself maybe requires some clarifying. So it's being driven by wounding that I'm not able to fully be with. And so it's a sort of like truck barreling down the highway with no brakes. That's maybe a way of thinking of it. Because it's not problematic in and of itself that wounding gets touched. The problem is, how do I relate to that wounding when it gets touched? Does my system get overwhelmed such that I'm not actually able to be present? I'm no longer driving the truck, but rather, historical wounded places in me are driving. Versus, something sensitive can get touched, but if I'm able to stay totally present, well, then I can work with that. I can be helping that metabolize through. I can be feeling whatever the feelings are. And I'm still going to have access to my grounded self, right? But if I'm caught up in, if I'm sort of taken over by, sort of possessed by, if you will, which makes me think about how, there's a lot of movies in our culture about, ghost possession stuff, right? Demon possession, whatever. Which I think is an interesting kind of cultural symbolic metaphor, because I think that's happens a ton in our culture. I think there's a lot of people that are spending a good chunk of their life sort of possessed by wounded parts of themselves that they're not actually able to be present with. They're not actually able to help heal. And so they're just like reliving trauma over and over and perpetuating it because we keep telling stories about ourselves and about other people that are only in the scope of what our traumatized parts knew. And they are not able to access wisdom. They're not able to access compassion. They're not able to access the good that is also present in our life, potentially, hopefully. I mean, I think about places in my journey where a part of me just wanted to double down on like, no, you don't fucking understand. And it's terrible like this. And it's always been, and it's always going to be. And it's like, man, what a well of misery I just was like digging deeper and deeper into. And it's not that my pain wasn't real, but I was cutting myself off from the whole picture, right? That's the thing. And also in a sense, ironically, in that miserable kind of place, and maybe I'll do a video sometime about the ways we make ourselves miserable and how we seem to really like to make ourselves miserable. But like in that miserable place, I'm not actually even being fully with my pain. That's the real irony, right? It's like, it seems like it, but it's actually an avoidance. I'm avoiding going into the truly deep core of the pain by sort of hanging out in this surface misery place, and and complaining and whining. I did a video about, what is whining, whining versus real grieving. So anyways, bringing myself back around. Where was I? Oh, goodness. Have to have at least one of these moments every video. Yeah, I can't remember exactly where I was, but I know I wanted to pick up some point with, just reflecting on, like, how do we catch ourselves? How do we recognize and catch ourselves? So I'm always feeling for, like, is there any charge? Is there any emotional intensity is sort of a way of putting it. Although even that's not a totally clear way of languaging it. Because we can have intensity and still have grounding. There's such a feel to this. It's so tricky to describe. Yeah, I do struggle with like finding the words to like articulate this well. I'm trying to pay attention to, is there intensity that feels outsized? Like that it feels bigger than maybe the situation actually warrants? I'm trying to feel for, is there intensity that feels like it goes back, like it goes way back, right? Because that's what we're trying to tease out here is, how is my history potentially showing up in this moment and coloring this moment in an unhelpful way, in a way that's going to lead me to some inaccurate interpretations? Like, we're always influenced by our history. Our history is always a part of us. The question is, am I able to really be with my history in such a way that I can be informed by it, but not trapped by it? It's maybe a way of putting it. I can be informed by my history, but not trapped by my history. Because if I'm trapped by my history, that's when I'm going to tell false stories. Because the stories are going to be based on old data, right? Like, they may not be based on this other person at all. May not, like, the things I'm thinking and feeling and imagining might have nothing to do with them, right? Like, I mean, I think of like a classic, simple, but, very real example I think for many of us is like, the friend who doesn't respond promptly, a friend or loved one doesn't respond promptly. And then we start to tell ourselves this story of, oh, they're mad at me. Oh, they just don't care. Oh, they're more important. They have other things to do. All these different variations. And we don't freaking know. Like, we literally don't know. Our friend could be in someplace without cell service. They could have dropped their phone in the freaking toilet, like, they could have forgot to pay their phone bill. They could be in a car accident. They could be in a meeting. They could have lost their phone. Their battery could have gone dead. They could be on a phone call. There's so many things, and we literally do not know. And so here's one of the invitations, right, is can we cultivate the courage and humility to say, I actually do not know. I actually don't know what's going on. I don't know why they haven't responded. I don't know what that means. I can imagine all sorts of things that I'm afraid it means. And this is what we tend to do. This is part of how one of the ways we make ourselves miserable, right? Is we would rather than stay in that ambiguity, stay in the not knowing. We would rather decide something that's negative, right? Than just be like, I don't know, and I'll know when I know. And sometimes we'll never know. I mean, I've got so many things in my life where it's like, yeah, I'm never going to have an answer to that. I will never know what was going on with that person with that. I will never find out why this, that, or the other. And that's uncomfortable. But it's way better for me to be able to just stay with I don't know than to force an answer that I have no basis for, like, asserting. It's like, how the hell do I know that? Like, I have no way of confirming that, right? Like, I have no way of checking in, like, hey, is this what you were feeling? So that's one of the clues, right? Is am I making intense assertions about things I actually cannot verify at this point in time? Am I making negative assumptions, particularly? Now, I suppose there could be unhealthy sort of positive assumptions, right? Because that could be a different form of, like, if there's a way of coping where we just wouldn't be assuming the best in, like, a healthy sense. It would be, I'm going to avoid all conflict by just, like, I think often with this kind of pattern, it's going to have this quality of, a lot of times they'll have a subtle, like, what must be my fault kind of thing, I think, with this sort of positivistic thing. And so where we avoid holding anybody responsible for, kind of any kind of choices. And so then there's no actual real engagement. So it's a different kind of false story. That's a bit more complicated, I feel like, to tease out. If you're watching and you want to hear more about that, send me in a question, kind of giving me, because I think it would help having a specific example to work with, of, kind of illustrating that. And I think I could give a bit more insight and reflections on that. But I think that maybe the easier to grasp is sort of the negative version, right? Where I'm assuming I'm painting the other person as this horrible person, because that feels safer than just being like, I don't know why they haven't this, that, or the other. I don't know why they made this choice. I mean, I think about, right now, our current, political context, political climate is a great example where people on both sides, I'm sure, are doing this. And this is not to say that, there are all sorts of mistakes and saddening things across the board. And I'm not trying to say all things are equal, right? There's lots of complexity there, and this is not the context where I'm going to remotely try to unpack all that. All I'm trying to think about here is just the ways in which, and I talk about this in some other videos too, like the one where I encourage all of us to keep having meals with people we politically disagree with. Not because we need to agree with them, but because they're fellow humans, and it's important for us, it's important for society that we keep trying to understand one another, even in the places where we most disagree. So, but yeah, I'm hearing a lot of folks, both directions, telling characterological stories, right? So I'm not, this isn't talking about, like, I know there's like verifiable things of, like, this person was literally at this event, like, we can verify that, blah, blah, blah. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how we tell stories about the underlying characterological things, and therefore, they're scum, therefore they're disgusting, therefore da da da. And the thing is, when we make that move, right, like, there's just so many costs to ourselves in that, to say nothing, of course, of, like, it kills any opportunity for being able to, connect with our fellow human. And we might think, well, I don't want to connect with them because they're terrible, for fill in the blank reasons. But there's a way in which when we disown our fellow humans, we disown something in ourselves too. Because if I'm not willing to be open to there somehow being a shared humanity here, even though we arrive at very different choices, very different conclusions, very different answers, right, on things, but that there's a shared humanity underneath all of that, if I'm unwilling to try to be curious about that, to try to connect with that, again, not saying I don't have to abandon my principles about sort of these things above that, right? In terms of we're making very different decisions about whatever things, right? I can still have all my principles, have all my ethics. But yeah, if I won't work to connect with the shared humanity of that person, there's a way in which I'm also practicing not being connected to that in myself. And I've just seen that always comes back to bite us. Like that harshness that we have towards the other, even though there may be all sorts of reasons to have concerns, to have grief about the differences in choices that we are making, but the harshness, the unwillingness to keep the story open in terms of the underlying human elements, right? And to not assume that, well, they're just horrible, I mean, because that's I don't know if you can see there, but even in whatever we think is the most just cause to be concerned about, when we start talking about our opponents in these kinds of ways, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from, well, therefore they don't deserve to live. I mean, I see this on the freaking internet. I literally see people in comment section like both directions, right? There doesn't seem to be any distinction in terms of political right or left on this. I see people from both sides saying really awful things. And granted, the internet, people say awful things on the internet, but it illustrates, right? How it's not good for us to flirt with that, right? We need to be able to stay open to that. This is a fellow human. They may be making choices that I don't understand. They may be making choices that I consider really awful, but they are still a fellow human. Can I keep my heart open to that? Can I bear the grief of somehow this fellow human is choosing to do things that I think are awful, choices? So let me bring this back a bit, because we could go on and on about the political stuff. But yeah, coming back around to just thinking about what are the stories that I am telling myself about other people, and paying attention to how is their charge going on for me? In what ways am I unwilling to? I mean, and this would be building on what we were just talking about. Am I unwilling to let the humanity of the other person still be in the equation? In what ways am I making them into a caricature, into a villain? This is, I think, an interesting thing about really good stories in the sense of storytelling, whether novels or movies, is that a compelling villain, there are things about them that we can relate to. There are things about them where it's we feel maybe some of the tragedy, of that they've experienced. And if a story's done really well, I would say a true story, not saying it it can be fiction, but it's true in the sense that it's telling truths about the human experience, it doesn't shy away from the actions being wicked, the actions being evil, and yet we can feel the conflictedness of and yet this is still a human being. This is still a being of value, even as they're perpetrating awful things. And so that is really good storytelling. That is truthful storytelling, right? And so I think that actually maybe is another great barometer, right? Am I writing, am I telling sort of a lazy, cheap story, right? Where it's just where the other person is just one-dimensional. Or is it nuanced? Is it complicated? Is it confusing of I don't fully understand what's going on with them here. Again, whether the political thing or just, thinking about the day to day, right? The person who doesn't respond to our text or whatever, or call us back, or, somebody who, seemed like as we're driving by, like made a face at us or something. It's like, well, I don't know. Was that, I don't even know. Was that meant for me? Did I cut them off or something? Did they think I cut them off? Are they on the phone? I mean, who knows, right? I had an experience several months ago where somebody, they got really mad at me on the road and they flipped me off. And I had not done anything terrible to them. I had not done anything that, in my opinion, to deserve that. I hadn't tried to run them off the road or wasn't tailgating them. But they were doing something dangerous, and I was not collaborating with that dangerous choice. And they really got pissed off because they were trying to force something. And it was technically illegal and definitely dangerous and almost caused an accident. And and so then they were mad at me for that because I wouldn't just stay the hell out of their way. I'm like, I'm also on the road too, and I get to matter too, and you're not a police officer. You don't get to, you don't have your lights on. You don't get to just shove me off the road. And I don't know what's going on with them. I know that action was really unkind. I know that their behavior on the road seemed dangerous and sketchy. But what else is going on there? I don't know. I need to let the rest of that be open, Maybe they're trying to get to the hospital. Maybe they're late for their job. Maybe they're just in a foul mood. I don't freaking know. I won't ever know. I know that they flipped me off. I know they seemed really unhappy with me, and they made some choices in terms of the driving that were really uncomfortable and a little scary. That's all I got, And so I have to let the rest of that story be unwritten because I don't know. And I probably won't ever see that person again, and I won't ever get to find out. So, dude, what was going on there? What was the deal that, you felt you needed to do those things and to, risk both of our lives in those ways? So I have to let that go in a sense, let that be open, let it be unfinished, and not be like, oh, they're a terrible human being. First of all, I shouldn't go make that move if they're a terrible human being. That's a shaming route, right? I can say, I disagree with how they were driving. Some of that, I think, pretty sure was illegal. Some of it definitely felt dangerous. So that, I'm speaking about the actions, right? But in terms of motive, I don't know. And I won't know. And so in the absence of more information, I have to let that be open and not make it into this people these days, and fill in the gaps with this terrible story that's why do that? Why make, the world has plenty of darkness. It has plenty of ugliness. I don't need to make it darker by making shit up that I don't know. Right. So I hope this is giving you some kind of feel for sort of the energy, right? There's an energy to these stories that we make up, right? There's a one-dimensionalness, right? To how we're, portraying the other characters in the story, right? There's, sort of an overly simplisticness. There's a way in which we are asserting all sorts of things we don't actually have a way of verifying characterologically, right? So there can be logistical things, again, my story about the road rage thing or whatever. I can assert the things that I saw logistically, but I don't know what's going on there, psychologically, other than it seemed like they were angry, it was a very angry flipping the bird at me. So body language wise, that seemed pretty unambiguous. But again, I don't know anything else, right? And so I can't, it's not, if I'm assuming that, if I'm adding in all these embellishments, it's I'm making shit up that I actually don't know and I have no way of verifying. And that doesn't help me. That just stirs me up, right? I'm just rehearsing a negative story. Is that the world I want to live in, right? Can I stay open to that there could be all sorts of complexity there? Can I stay open to all sorts of nuance about my fellow humans, whatever the situation may be? So yes, I hope this is giving you some kind of feel. As I said earlier, it's really hard to put into words. Like when I'm working with people, or when I'm talking with a friend, or when I'm working with myself, like it's a very intuitive feel that I've learned to tune into. I've learned to recognize, like like with myself, like that's got some charge to it. That's got some edge to it. That's got some there's some stuff there. There's something unresolved there that isn't about just this moment. It's got some history to it. And then I start to get curious. So I'll say a little bit about this, So then again, the thing is to get curious. Okay, like, when have I felt this before? What does this remind me of? And we might quickly be like, and they're just like so-and-so. It's like, okay, so that's already given me clues, right? Like, this reminds me of something, with a parent or another, or, maybe a former partner or family member or employer or who knows, right? But it's echoing back to prior experiences that I apparently am not finished having feelings about. And so what I need there, and I talk more about this in other videos, but what I need there is I need somebody who has the emotional capacity to sit with me as I'm trying to build the ability to actually feel those emotions and not just get drowned in them, not just get possessed by them, right? The goal is, and I talk about this in the What is Trauma video, like the goal here is to actually be able to feel the feelings fully, because that's what's going to help the charge move through. Like stuff, we keep getting triggered in places because we're not done feeling the feelings, because we're not able to actually stay present to them. And so we disassociate to some degree, and then it stays stuck to get triggered yet again and again and again, and fuel all these stories that we tell ourselves about how terrible other people are, right? And so, it's like that keeps us stuck. It keeps us stuck. It kills connection with our fellow humans. It makes the world a lot more scary than it needs to be. The world, it can be a very scary place, right? But it also can be a very beautiful and generous place. And so again, the goal is to be present to the whole picture. I want to be able to face all of the hard and face all of the good and all of the beauty. And the world really is made up of both. And we are made up of both. I'm made up of both. You're made up of both, right? Like, as I'm often fond of saying, like, I want us to grow in being able to bear the burden and the beauty of our lives, right? And it really is work to bear both, to be present to both, to feel both, to live into both. So I hope that, hope you've been able to hang with me in my meandering here. I hope this is helpful, and just paying attention to, and watching for, like, what kinds of stories are you telling about the people around you? And, like, how much of that is coming from a helpful place and how much of it's coming from wounding? And then to get curious about the wounding and to really try to love those hurting parts of you. Because that's what they're calling out for. They're saying, hey, pay attention to us. Well, until next time, peace be with you.